Commission, which would include 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 independents. A panel of retired Democratic and Republican judges would choose the commission members from a pool of applicants for the position. The only requirement for being on this commission would be that you can't be a current or former elected official or an officer of one of the major political parties. And lobbyists would also be elected from the commission. The commission would hire nonpartisan map makers who come up with maps that would not favor one party or the other, and not favor any specific candidate. They'd hold public hearings, allow citizens to submit their own maps for consideration. And the results would, they hope, create more competitive districts and create a legislature that's more in line with the actual voting patterns will hide.
So why do supporters of the measure say it's necessary to change the system and take it out of the hands of politicians?
Well, voting rights groups in Ohio thought they had solved the problem back in 2015 and 2018 when they supported redistricting plans that they believed would take much of the politics out of the process so voters overwhelmingly approved those ballot issues. But the new plans proved to be dismal failures. What it produced in the latest round was a redistricting commission made up of 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. Last year, the Republican majority managed to game the system and kick the can down the road long enough to get what they wanted. A guaranteed veto-proof supermajority in both the Ohio House and the Senate, and a 15-member congressional delegation made up of 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats. This was resolved despite the fact that last year a overwhelming majority of the Ohio Supreme Court rejected the Ohio GOP maps 5 times, saying they gave the Republicans an unfair advantage. This year, the Republicans are trying something different, taking the map drawing out of the hands of elected officials. Very much like the plan Michigan voters approved 3 years ago, which had a huge impact on legislative elections in Michigan 2 years ago.
What do they need to do to get this voted out?
We need to gather the ballot signatures of about 414,000 Ohio voters from at least 34 states and counties, and they have to do that live voting. Start Citizens Not Voting has thousands of volunteers around the state, armed with clipboards and sitting signatures right now. The organization Common Cause Ohio League of Women. They're very good at this. They know what they're doing. So I have no doubt that they're going to reach their goal. I'm sure that this is an idea that voters will decide in November.
Howard, thank you so much. Howard Wilkinson is WVXU's senior political analyst. You can read his politically speaking column at WVXU.org.
Support comes from Caracol, 12 months of giving donation drive, welcoming any company, house of worship, book club, or group to host a collection drive of personal care and cleaning supply items for clients in need. Learn how your donation can support their mission to positively change lives in the fight against HIV at caracol.org/collect.
Support comes from Bethany Seminary in Richmond, Indiana, introducing Bethany Bold for exceptional studies to address real-world issues like poverty and racial justice through service work while earning a graduate degree. Learn more about receiving housing, full tuition scholarships, and a monthly stipend at bethanyseminary.edu/EOLD.
This is 91.7 WVXU. It's 8:50. Coming up at 9 o'clock on the BBC NewsHour. We'll hear how the U.S. and U.K. strike Houthi targets in Yemen. Will Red Sea attacks cease or increase? Also live in Taiwan ahead of Saturday's presidential election. An Ivory Coast moment of sporting glory. Coming up on the BBC NewsHour, that starts at 9 o'clock. In about 10 minutes here on 91.7 WVXU. Southbound 71 after Red Bank. The 2 right lanes are blocked by a wreck. Traffic is stopped up in Montgomery. Southbound 71 after Reagan. There's a wreck on the right shoulder. 9 first morning weather, rain likely with heavy rain possible today. Some gusty afternoon and evening winds up to temperature 50. A wintry mix turning to wet snow tonight. Shouldn't accumulate at all. The roads will still be pretty warm. The low 25. Tomorrow, colder and windy, mostly cloudy. The high 30 and even 40 for the rest of the weekend. 41 degrees now in Cincinnati. This is 91.7 WVXU.
I'm Stephen Duggan. On the next Freakonomics Radio, how do airlines make their money?
Airlines face incredibly volatile demand, and they have huge fixed costs.
And what impact do cheap flights have on the environment?
The only solutions are either you don't fly or you use sustainable aviation fuel.
That's next time on Freakonomics Radio.
Sunday afternoons at 4 and Tuesday nights at 11 on 91.7 WVXU.
As the war in the Middle East expands, so too do its economic shockwaves.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by UiPath. More than 10,000 organizations use the UiPath AI-powered business automation platform to put AI to work. UiPath.com/marketplace. UiPath, the foundation of innovation. And by Charles Schwab. Schwab believes every investor deserves to work with a firm they can count on, with financial consultants ready to serve clients and 24/7 live help.
From Marketplace, I'm Sabrina Benashore, in for David Boccaccio. The U.S. and Britain struck military bases across Yemen overnight in response to attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea by Yemen's rebel Houthi group. The spiral of retaliation of which that is a part continues to ripple out into the global economy. The latest sign, Tesla plans to pause production at a plant in Germany, citing supply chain delays caused by changes in shipping routes. Marketplace's Henriette has more.
Tesla will stop producing most electric cars at its plant outside of Berlin for about 2 weeks, starting January 29th. The company relies on components from Asia, and in a statement to Reuters, Tesla says attacks on container ships in the Red Sea mean those parts now have to instead travel around South Africa, which takes a lot longer. The Red Sea is the fastest shipping route between Asia and Europe, but freight movement through the region has dropped off significantly since Houthi rebels began attacking commercial ships in the past few months. Diverting freight to other routes has driven up shipping costs, which could put upward pressure on inflation. For Tesla, pausing production in Germany is just the latest headache in the region. It's also facing a strike and boycotts by labor unions across Scandinavia. I'm Henry Allen for Marketplace.
When kids are out of school for the summer, they spend more time at home and more time eating there. For low-income families, that is a significant added expense. Well, this summer, millions of low-income American families will get extra help with their food bills. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has a new summer EBT program for your families that are already eligible for your reduced price lunch during the school year, $40 a month for an eligible child to spend at the grocery store. Marketplace's Savannah Maher has more.
The USDA tested this program during the pandemic, and it found that grocery assistance filled gaps left by its existing summer food service program, which requires kids to physically show up somewhere at a specific time and eat their lunch on site.
It's always reached only a fraction of the kids who rely on free and reduced price school meals,
says Crystal Fitzsimon with the Food Research and Action Center.
Depending on the summer, it's 1 in 6 or 1 in 7.
Because of transportation issues, distance to the meal location, working parents' busy schedules.
Not to mention any, potential stigma associated with it.
Emily Gutierrez with the Urban Institute says summer EBT gives families flexibility to buy their preferred foods. Plus, those families are probably already going to the grocery store,
as opposed to having to make another trip.
Grocery prices high, still rising, per Thursday's CPI report. Gutierrez says that extra $40 per month per kid only goes so far. I'm Savannah Maher for Marketplace.
All right, let's do the numbers. Dow futures are down 111 points, that's 0.3%. S&P and NASDAQ futures are about flat. The yield on the 10-year Treasury is 3.970%.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by C3 Generative AI. Verified traceable answers, secure, hallucination-free, LLM-agnostic, IP liability-free. Learn more at c3.ai. And by Progressive Insurance with Snapshot. Learn more about Snapshot at progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Snapshot not available in California, North Carolina, or from all agents. And by Viking, exploring the world in comfort. With a fleet of small ships, Viking offers travel experiences for the thinking person. Discover more at Viking.com.
Voters in Taiwan will elect a new president and legislature on Saturday. The U.S. allies' increasingly tense relationship with Beijing has dominated the election campaigns. But for many residents, it's the economy and how to make a living that are the biggest issues. The BBC's Cindy Sue reports.
Jenny Wong has been working at this needle shop for several years, earning around $1,300 a month. His wife makes about the same amount, but they barely have enough to support their 2 young daughters.
We try our best to be frugal, such as by cutting down on entertainment, like watching a movie or traveling. We avoid smoking or eating a big meal out.
He says he can only dream of owning a home and doesn't think the election will change that. Jenny Wong is also worried about losing his job. Inflation has driven up the cost of products the needle shop uses. Goose meat has risen by 15% and pork by 30% this year. Now his boss is planning to close the store because it's no longer making a profit.
There's nothing I can do but try to find another job.
Taiwan's economy grew by just under 1.5% last year. While wages have increased, they haven't kept up with inflation, which is more than 2%, and food prices have risen by 3 times as much. The profits of technology giants such as global semiconductor maker TSMC and electronics assembler Foxconn aren't filtering down to ordinary people like Chen Yahui. She owns a small eatery and says she's making 30 to 40% less than she was before the pandemic.
In the past, a family of 4 would buy 4 box meals from us. Now, they buy only 2 and take them home to share.
Chen Yahui says the current ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, is too focused on bickering with the Chinese government and instead needs to focus on improving people's living standards.
When both sides' economies have problems, how could you fight with each other? When you don't even have money to buy rice, how could you buy bullets?
Rising inflation and the difficulty of buying property is making many young people lose hope in Taiwan. College student Jack He works in a beverage store, earning around $6 an hour, just a little bit more than the minimum wage. After he graduates, he wants to move abroad.
I should try to push for a change, but I realize there's no way to change the current situation. The sense of helplessness is very strong in Taiwan.
Both the US and China will be closely watching the outcomes of the elections, but the deciding votes may be economic rather than political. In Taiwan, I'm the BBC's Cindy Sue for Marketplace.
Our executive producer is Kelly Silveira. Our digital producer is Dylan Mietzman. Our engineers are Jessen Dueller and Brian Allison. And I'm Sabri Benishore with the Marketplace Morning Report. From 8 p.m., American Public Media.
Good morning. This is 91.7 WVXU. Rain likely heavy at times today. Gusty afternoon and evening winds. The high temperature 50. A wintry mix turning to wet snow with little to no accumulation tonight. The low temperature 25. 41 now.
Support comes from Cincinnati Cancer Advisors, providing consultative oncology services, including secondary care.
Hi, do you have a rewards code?
Yes.
What's your code?
0730.
One moment, please. I got your code. What can I get for you?
It's actually an app pickup.
What was the code again? Could you give me that code again? Let me get another crew member to assist you with our rewards program. Hi, what can I get for you?
I got an app order.
You have a mobile order?
Yeah.
What was the number?
WW11.
Just a second, I had it come up. Alright, go ahead and pull on around. Thank you.
Thanks. That's new. Now it's automated. Hello.
Mobile order? Do you
Yeah.
have the receipt?
Yes, please.
Okay,
Thanks. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour. It's coming to you live from the BBC World Service from me, Tim Franks in London, and in about 15 minutes you'll hear from Celia Hatton in Taiwan. For the last 3 months or so, Yemen's Houthi militia have been attacking commercial ships sailing through the Red Sea. Early today, Friday, the US and UK military hit back. Footage provided by the UK Ministry of Defence of Royal Air Force jets taking off to bomb Houthi positions inside Yemen, more than 60 The Iran-backed militia group, which now controls a large swathe of Yemen, has been attacking commercial vessels with drones and ballistic missiles since Israel began its war in Gaza after those Hamas missions in early October. In November, the Houthis also hijacked and continue to hold one cargo ship. Why then has the Western response come now? This was the British Armed Forces Minister, James Heapy, speaking to the BBC today.
We felt that the targets prosecuted last night were limited, proportionate, necessary to disrupt the Houthi capability to attack shipping in the Red Sea. And it's important, I think, to make the point that no matter what you think about the narrative that the Houthis put out about this, sympathy and solidarity with the Hamas cause, the world cannot be held to ransom with the Houthis deliberately seeking to deny the movement of commercial shipping through a seaway that routinely moves around 20% of global trade.
The British Armed Forces Minister James Heapy. Jane Kinnerman is with us today. She's Director of Policy and Impact at the European Leadership Network and a Middle East specialist. Jane, very good to have you on the programme. Several dozen targets then that were hit. A few Houthis have been killed, we're told. What do you take of not just the fact of this, these strikes by the British and American military, but also the extent of them?
The UK's got a delicate balancing act here because both the UK and the US want to repel these attacks on shipping. At the same time, it's part of a wider picture of regional conflict where the US wants to they've concluded that striking these targets could be done in a limited way that won't provoke much wider violence.
Right, well, we'll hear how the Houthis may respond in a moment. But just remind us, first of all, if you can, I mean, I know it's a long history, but if you can give us a potted history of who the Houthis are.
So the Houthis have been on a remarkable trajectory over the last 2 decades. 20 years ago this was a small group of guerrillas active in northern Yemen where they were fighting against the Yemeni government. They're from the Zaydi Shia minority. They felt that they should have more power and more religious rights and so on. But 10 years ago they managed to take power in Yemen when there was a political transition there. They essentially carried out a coup. They were then attacked by a Saudi-led coalition who did not want this group, who were rapidly becoming closer and closer to Iran, being on the Saudi borders. Saudi Arabia and the Houthis are now in the middle of a peace process which was helping to stabilise Yemen, but the Gaza war has enabled the Houthis to take this opportunity to show what they can do on the Red Sea at a time when they've got significant political support in the Arab world, where there's a growing frustration that Western countries are not able to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza or help the Palestinians even to access basic food and water.
Jane, for the time being, thank you very much. We've managed to get through to one resident of Sana'a in Yemen. She is Radia Al-Mutawakil. She says that the missile strikes made for a fearful night.
Yesterday we heard explosions that took us back to the beginning of the war. It was terrifying for Yemenis. If this is a new circle of a war, while they still stuck in the first circle of the war, they still didn't even get over it. People, they don't know if it is one-time airstrikes, if it is going on, to what extent it's going to expand. So it was a very bad night for all Yemenis. It was like they are showing off more than they are just targeting a real military targets. This is what the sense that the Yemenis got from the airstrikes yesterday.
When you said that you're concerned that you may be sort of going back to the worst dark days of war, and there's been so many terrible moments of conflict over the last pretty much 10 years, do you think that this is something now which is sort of more likely than not, or do you think there's a chance that, you know, the Western military have shown their displeasure with what the Houthis are doing, and, you know, that will be it?
After 8 and 9 years of war, of a very strong military campaign, Houthis are stronger and are able to send rockets to the Red Sea. So a new circle of a war will get what? It is a very risky adventure that will just cause another disaster, because Yemen, it's known now like the worst military crisis in the world, and we are still there. We're in a place where there is no war, no peace, and the situation in Yemen is still very bad for civilians. This will never be a solution for what's happening in the Red Sea.
Radia Al-Mutawakil, resident of the Yemeni capital Sana'a, speaking to me just a little bit earlier. How are the Houthis themselves likely to respond? Hussein Al-Fati is a Yemeni journalist based also in Sana'a, who describes himself as a Houthi supporter. Tell me more about the strikes. How significant is the damage?
I don't think it will have any effect because, to be honest with you, Saudi Arabia and the coalition supported by the UK and US have launched a war, a 9-year war against Yemen. They have conducted hundreds of thousands of kills, right, during this 8 years of war. And what was the result? The Yemeni army, or as they call them Ansarullah, the Houthi, they become stronger, they have more sophisticated weapons, have the ability to launch attacks in many areas, including the entire Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. So this means that wars and strikes actually is making them stronger.
What do you think will be the Houthi response to this?
The Houthi response is clearly, as the leader of Ansarullah, the Houthi have said, he said any attack on Yemen, it will result in an attack on all the battleships and the interests of countries who are involved in attacking Yemen, and their interests as well in the area. And at one point he said the commercial ships of those countries might as well come under attack. And yesterday, as we speak, before the attack, he has warned any attack on Yemen will result in a huge attack on all the battleships, specifically of those countries like United Kingdom and as well the United States. But of course, if the United States and the United Kingdom will continue attacking Yemen, I'm sure that the next step, it will be to target commercial ships linked or belong to UK company or as well to United States company. Because as they say here as well, according to international law, if you are in a war with a country, you have the right to stop and to search or to sink any ship, even commercial ship, anything that is aided your enemy. And of course, all the ships that belong to United Kingdom and UK and United States might come as well under attack.
Well, you mentioned international law. What in that case do you make of the fact that this week the Security Council has passed a resolution which condemns, and I quote, in the strongest terms, the at least 24 Houthi attacks on merchant and commercial vessels since November, and demands that the Houthis immediately cease all such attacks?
Look, they said soon there was as well that the Security Council in 2015 was called 2216, which has supported the Saudi war and as well the blockade on Yemen. And here they say the Houthi official and Houthi military commander, they say all UN Security Council resolution is under our feet, because they all know, as they say, that this UN Security Council is controlled by those Western countries. And just imagine...
Well, hang on. The UN Security Council is not controlled by Western countries. China and Russia both have vetoes. They didn't use their vetoes.
That's the thing. I mean, they haven't used the veto, but they abstained. So that the resolution...
So this resolution passed? Yeah. So you were the person who invoked international law. The Security Council has clearly said that these attacks are against international law.
But I believe it could be better if the Security Council says that Israel should stop its genocide. And Yemeni here, they say they will cease all their attacks against Israeli-linked ships or ships headed towards Israel for a simple demand. And this demand is to lift the blockade against Gaza and to allow food and medicine and fuel and water to enter Gaza. And this demand actually is the same demand of the Secretary General of the United Nations, the same demand of Amnesty International, the Human Rights Watch, the UNICEF. They all demanded to allow food and medicine. So it's so simple. Why United States want to militarize the Red Sea, was to put the international shipping in danger by conducting this type of attack against Yemen. They could just simply force Israel to allow food and medicine and fuel to enter Gaza and what's needed for the civilian population.
Hussein al-Haiti, a pro-Houthi Yemeni journalist speaking to me from Sana. The Middle East expert Jane Kinnamont is still with us. Jane, do you think this has been war-gamed by British and American military planners? I mean, there is that sort of sense that despite all the dire warnings, that northern front between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon hasn't quite exploded into sort of the terrible all-out war that some are fearing. But do you think that there are sort of similar controls at work with this front?
These developments are newer, so it's harder to predict what will happen with the Houthis than with Hezbollah, which is better known. But I do think one of the interesting elements of the interview that you've just done is that the demand being expressed there is for food, fuel, medicine, etc. to be allowed back into Gaza rather than a ceasefire. So it's quite interesting because that is potentially something that could be done. We'll see what the International Court of Justice says today, but it's possible that they might ask for measures also including the entry of these vital humanitarian supplies into Gaza, and maybe there could be something that is a diplomatic, peaceful solution to all of this.
And just briefly, Jane, I mean, the implications of all this for there to be an end to the civil war inside Yemen?
Probably sets it back, especially if this continues and creates more divisions, but it seems for now that quite a lot of Yemenis who don't normally like the Houthis are expressing some sympathy with what they're doing, because there is a lot of Yemeni solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Jane Kinnamont, great to have you back on News App.
Oh boy. Going to Oxford.
On Taiwan ahead of the island's election this weekend. That's coming up on 91.7 WBSU.
Support comes from Bethany Seminary in Richmond, Indiana, introducing Bethany Bowl for exceptional students to address real-world issues like poverty and racial justice through service work while earning a graduate degree. Learn more about receiving housing, full tuition scholarships, and a monthly stipend at bethanyseminary.edu/BOLD.
At the end of your day, after working, parenting, or running errands, I think you're ready to know what's going on in the world from your home and beyond. I'm Bill Reinhardt, and I bring you NPR's All Things Considered, plus local news, weather, and traffic. I'll help keep you informed starting at 4 p.m. on WVXU.
Hey, it's Layla Falded. What you do in the morning helps set the tone for the rest of your day. Meditating can ease you in, keep you grounded and calm. Journaling may give you a sense of intention and purpose. And working out could add a boost of energy. If you want to feel balanced, informed, and connected to the world around you, here's another morning ritual for you. Listening to Morning Edition from NPR News. Every weekday, no yoga mats or weights required.
On 91.7 WVXU.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Hiscox, committed to helping small businesses protect their dreams. Quotes and information on customized insurance for specific risks are available at hiscox.com. Hiscox, business insurance experts. From the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, for nearly a century, supporting efforts to promote a just, equitable, and sustainable society. More at mott.org. John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
I'm Indira Lakshmanan. This is 1A. We're back to the roundup after we pose this week's news quiz question. Okay, news junkies, brace yourselves. This week, you may have seen reports that there are plans in New York to turn Broadway purple. We want to know why. We have some exclusive 1A swag on offer. If you know the answer, use the 1A Vox Pop app or visit today's show page at the1a.org to tell us your answer. We're accepting entries through midnight on Sunday. Good luck. I also want to let you know that on Tuesday, Jen White and her guests will break down the Iowa results from the caucuses. She would love to hear from you, of course. So for all the media attention, how much does Iowa matter? Send us your answers. Now let's get back to the roundup. We're here with Idris Kaloun, Washington Bureau Chief for The Economist, and Benji Sarlin, Washington Bureau Chief at Semaphore. So Donald Trump wasn't on the debate stage in Iowa this week, but he was plenty busy in court. On Tuesday, federal appeals court judges here in D.C. heard defense arguments that the former president should be immune from prosecution on charges that he plotted to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The panel of 3 judges pressed Trump's legal team to defend claims that their client was shielded from criminal charges for acts that he says fell within his official duties as president. Benji, did it surprise you that Donald Trump chose to be in court to hear this appeal, and how did it play out?
I was not surprised. And the reason is that Donald Trump, as he has said lately, is trying to go to as many trials as possible. And you might say, well, that's a strange thing. It's just a few days before the Iowa caucus. Should you be out there shaking hands in the cold and, giving big rallies? But the truth is, Trump's legal strategy and his political strategy are one and the same at this point, which is arguably the single most decisive factor in his victory this cycle has been that he's discovered Republican voters get extremely protective of him whenever he seems to be in legal jeopardy. They donate to his campaign. They rally, his support surges in polls. This has been true since his very first indictment in Manhattan in March. And the campaign is really leaning into it this way, going repeatedly to court dates that he has, no need to be at. He could be having an event in Iowa or New Hampshire if he wanted. And so in that context, yes, he's just trying to show his face as much as possible.
It took some probing from Judge Florence Pan to pin down Trump's lawyer, John Sauer, but in the end, Sauer made this claim that former presidents are absolutely immune from prosecution, even for murders they may have ordered while in office.
I asked you a yes or no question. Could a president who ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival who was not impeached, would he be subject to criminal prosecution?
If he were impeached and convicted first,
So your answer is
my answer is qualified yes.
As generally understood, Idris, impeachment is a political process, not a criminal one, but Trump's legal team seems to be linking the two. Why?
So the basic
answer is that, Donald Trump's lawyers are very effective at generating new, previously unheard of legal arguments that are basically the effect of getting Donald Trump off of a criminal conviction. What's interesting here is that the lawyers are making an argument that is the exact inverse of the one that they made in the aftermath of January 2021. Back then, Donald Trump's team was arguing that he could not be impeached or convicted because he had since left office after January 6th, and that he could be held to account in the criminal courts. What his lawyers are saying now that they're being brought in front of the criminal courts is that actually what should have happened is Congress should have impeached him and convicted him then if they wanted to reprimand him, and now that they missed their chance, they cannot do so. As the judge pointed out there, that logic leaves a lot of things open. It leaves the potential of SEAL Team 6, as she said, assassinating a political rival, and Trump's lawyer slightly floundered there. I don't think that that's something that they sincerely maybe hold on to, but it might be interesting post November 5th what they think Joe Biden can and can't do.
After the hearing, Donald Trump spoke to reporters and he issued this warning.
This is the way they're going to try and win, and that's not the way it goes. That'll be bedlam in the country. It's a very bad precedent. As we said, it's the opening of a Pandora's box, and it's a very sad thing that's happened with this whole situation.
So Benji, part of this is that Trump seems to be, threatening that if you don't agree with me, if you don't support me, we're going to release, the dogs of hell or something. There's going to be utter chaos if I'm convicted. And on Wednesday, the former president was pressed again on Fox News about whether he would denounce political violence, especially people rising up in anger against any, legal action against him. How did he answer, Benji?
Ambiguously, which is what he always does. Trump loves having this air of menace, this air of violence, that maybe something bad will happen. He's not saying he's doing it, but maybe it will happen. And then he can quickly, kind of squirm away from it if anyone asks him the details. So in this case, he quickly pivoted when he was asked to just attack Joe Biden. He said Joe Biden, quote, is bedlam, whatever that means. But this is something we've seen many times before, and we know where it leads. I mean, in 2016, he said there would be riots if he lost the nomination, and that bad things would happen. Is he telling people to riot? What bad things? It's all just ambiguous enough. At the time, many Republicans, including people he was running against, who are now major supporters, were, accusing him of inciting violence and warning that something that sounds an awful lot like January 6th would happen one day. And, those warnings turned out to be fairly prescient. We know what happens at this point when he says, for example, Proud Boys stand back and stand by at a debate. The Proud Boy leader's getting 22 years in prison now for a seditious conspiracy involving January 6th. It's like there's always ambiguity to the statements themselves, but we do know the results at this point.
Mm-hmm. And yet, of course, to this point, the former president himself has not been held accountable for stand by and stand back or his incitement on January 6th. So, Idris, when can we expect a ruling from the federal court? And if it doesn't go Trump's way, what happens next?
We don't know for sure, but the judges, as you can tell there, were pretty skeptical of that argument. So I imagine it won't go Donald Trump's way. But the decision is expected to arrive, ahead of the March 4th trial date, when Donald Trump will be held to account for the crimes related to the attempt to overturn the election in 2020. And his team has tried to throw quite a lot of arguments at the judges, and this is an unprecedented situation for America. The Constitution is not really written to deal with a president who might do the kinds of things that Donald Trump did, and so it has produced all these novel constitutional arguments that judges are having to sort through. We've seen a renaissance of interpretation of provision of the 14th Amendment, whether or not the president is even liable or able to be on the ballot because he might have participated in insurrection. This is something that's going to occupy judges, and ultimately it's such an important question that a lot of this is going to end up before the Supreme Court, as the cases about Trump's ballot eligibility are going to in the coming weeks.
Well, here's a question from one of our listeners, Reed in Florida, who asks, I've heard for years that the Justice Department has a policy that a sitting president shouldn't be indicted. Is there a statute or constitutional provision that supports that? Do you know the answer to that?
Benji, I wonder what you think. My memory of the Mueller hearing was that this was internal Office of Legal Counsel kind of inquiry, and this was the outcome of their report, but maybe you know better than me.
I'll stick to you on this one.
All right, we might have to have another show with some legal experts on to debate that. All right, meanwhile, we're lucky enough to be joined now on the line by CNN national politics reporter Eva McKen. She's joining us from cold and snowy Iowa this weekend. Eva, thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love to hear from you first. Aside from how cold it is up there, what are you hearing from Iowans ahead of Monday's caucuses?
Well, thanks for having me on. You know, Iowa are showing great resolve. They're still showing up to campaign events to hear from these candidates ahead of the caucus. But there is some anxiety, especially among the campaigns. You know, this is slated to be the coldest caucus day in history on Monday, below 0 temperatures. And so it might take a little bit more to get folks to actually come out of their homes and show up and turn out. Although Iowans, they have a lot of pride in this process. The ones that I speak to, they think it is a huge honor that Iowa goes first. And so there are still a lot of people that are engaged and ready to do whatever it takes to get out and caucus on Monday.
So, Eva, what are the top questions that you have for voters who you'll be interviewing in Iowa this weekend, those who brave the snow and the sub-zero temperatures?
Oh, well, I asked them why this process is so important to them, the ones that we meet that are moving on from former President Trump. I'll ask about why, because there are some undecided voters here between Nikki Haley, Governor DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, who may have actually previously voted for Trump in 2016, maybe switched their vote in 2020 for President Biden. Actually, quite a few voters like this, and then now are looking for a new candidate entirely. So I asked voters about their motivations for looking for an alternative, and there are a number of policy issues on their minds as well. Pretty in-depth questions that you'll hear from these Iowans about where the candidates stand on China, on the future of Social Security in this country, on restoring civility in politics. They come armed to these town halls and forums with lots of questions for these folks, as some of these Iowans are still vetting these folks and haven't made a decision as yet.
So, Eva, what you've described sounds like a beautiful showcase of American democracy at work right there, with, you know, people coming in with real questions about issues. Given how the polls seem to indicate that former President Donald Trump is going to run away with the Republican caucuses, how much do the Iowa caucuses really matter?
Well, Iowa has known historically to surprise the country in the past. So while the polls are somewhat instructive, they aren't the be-all and end-all. President Biden actually routinely says that polls don't vote, people do. So I think that there is still a lot of anticipation for Monday. Everyone could sort of be humbled by whatever the outcome is if the polls turn out not to be accurate. But listen, the former president does still have a lot of favor within among Republican primary voters. All of his many legal challenges have only seemed to strengthen those that support. Sometimes I'll be at different events, different forums, the Iowa Faith and Freedom forums, and you'll speak to voters and they'll say, we didn't know if we were going to support the former president, but now we think that we will because of all of these indictments that he faces. So this argument that he makes about the deep state, it seems to be penetrating down to voters who believe these arguments and are more inclined to support him. But listen, there are folks that are looking for alternatives. They may have liked some of the conservative policy positions that Trump was able to advance when he was in the White House, but they don't have an appetite for all of the chaos that he inspires.
All right, that was CNN national politics reporter Eva McKen in cold and snowy Iowa. We'll look forward to seeing you next time back in D.C., where at least it's above freezing here. Thank you so much, Eva.
Thank you.
So we're going from having talked about one courtroom chamber in D.C. Let's talk about another chamber in New York. Donald Trump was in court again on Thursday for closing arguments in the civil fraud trial against him. Earlier in the week, the judge had rejected the idea of the former president addressing the court, but he reversed himself later, permitting Trump to speak. Benji, again, the former president attended this hearing, which he did not need to do. Is it your sense that Trump cares more about cultivating a sense of grievance and victimhood than perhaps even he cares about that maybe more than the actual outcome of the trial?
Well, short answer is yes, but a little longer is no. Trump has always treated his legal situations like political situations, even before he was a political candidate. But especially now, it's always been about. He frequently has attacked the judges, claimed everything's a conspiracy against him, claims he's being unfairly persecuted. If you remember 2016, he spent weeks getting involved in a feud with, it wasn't a feud, it was just, abuse of Judge Gonzalo Curio. He was overseeing the, fraud case at quote-unquote Trump University, and his play was basically just to say a bunch of racist things about the judge, that because of his Mexican heritage, he wanted to rule against him, and you'd imply from there, well, how can I be fairly treated by this judge who is surely biased after I said all these racist things about him? It's kind of like an old Trump playbook. But now, this is a state case. But in some cases, the political and legal strategy is the same. I mean, if he becomes president again, he can derail the federal cases against him. And it would also make it much harder to bring some of these state cases against him while he's president, just on a practical matter. So his legal strategy is not like a legal strategy for someone like you or me. There are unique factors because of who he is and the possibility he might become president again.
So President Biden was out on the campaign trail too this week, and a Monday stop in South Carolina was briefly interrupted by protesters.
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right.
Idris, what was Biden doing in South Carolina?
So he was giving a speech at the church in Charleston where a few years ago in 2015 there was the horrific mass shooting and a couple of the congregants were killed. That was obviously huge.
Yeah, 9 black church members were killed in 2015. That's right.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And Biden at the time was deeply moved by it. He mentioned that he was returning there. He had come only 22 days after burying his son, Beau Biden, who had died of cancer. So it's an important place for him. South Carolina is an important state for him personally. He has a lot of attachment to it. It was incredibly important to him in 2020 in terms of securing the nomination. What he was there to talk about was not just that, but also the risk that the country was facing, and he tried to connect the two events to all of what is going on at the moment. So, and he's going to be back as well. So he's planning to visit South Carolina quite a lot.
All right, we'll talk more about that after the break with Idris Kaloun of The Economist and Semaphor's Benji Sarlin. I'm Indira Lakshmanan. Stay with us. This is 1A. This week, the U.S. and the U.K. strike targets in Yemen. Ecuador is thrown into turmoil after notorious gang leader disappears from prison. China heaps pressure on Taiwan ahead of the island's election this weekend. All the biggest stories from overseas on the News Roundup. Next hour on 1A.
Cincinnati broadcasting legend Nick Clooney turns 90 tomorrow. The Cincinnati edition will tour Augusta, Kentucky to speak with Nick about his career, his family, and much more. That's coming up at noon.
Support comes from Dupree House, premier senior living community, whose team of specialists can help with the resources you need to sell your home and guide you on what to take, what to sell, and what to give away. Dupree House focuses on you enjoying retirement living at its finest. For more information, visit dupreehouse.com.
I'm Christopher Kimball from Milkstream Radio. In the fishing villages of Norway, kids as young as 5 years old enter the workforce as professional cod tongue cutters.
I just had this dream where my cod tongues ended up on someone's plate at a restaurant. It was really cool to think about it.
Find out how kids master this skill and turn a profit this week on Milkstream Radio from PRX.
Sunday afternoons at 1 and Wednesday nights at 11 on 91.7 WBXU.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from your part-time controller, specializing in nonprofit accounting. Your part-time controller helps nonprofit organizations with their accounting needs remotely or in person at yptc.com/NPR. And from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, using research and evidence to develop solutions that help families and communities create a brighter future for young people. More information is available at aecf.org.
I'm Indira Lakshmanan, and this is 1A. Let's get back to the Friday News Roundup with Idris Kaloun of The Economist and Benji Sarlin of Semaphore. So there's been a fair share of drama here in D.C. this week. It turns out that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was in the hospital for several days before the White House and other top officials were told. Austin was admitted to the intensive care unit at Walter Reed Medical Center on January 1st, following severe pain and complications from prostate cancer surgery in late December that he had not told the White House about. Benji, what happened?
What happened was some total breakdown in communication here that they really are still just beginning to get to the bottom of. I mean, the Inspector General is going to start investigating, but even days after it came out that they had not informed, that, you know, somehow the White House had not been informed about Austin's hospitalization, they were still finding out pretty much in real time with the rest of us even why he was hospitalized, which was that complications from surgery to treat prostate cancer. So they're really still figuring out where this breakdown is. I mean, the White House has made clear that this is totally unacceptable, even as they have not called for Austin's resignation. But yeah, they're not just reviewing what happened here. They are now reviewing, you know, their process for transferring power and notifying the White House across every agency. So that's how big a deal this is right now.
Well, you know, let me follow up on that, because if the defense secretary goes to the hospital, and it happens to be that this week we actually had military strikes on the Houthis in Yemen, who is responsible for informing the White House and Congress? And should Austin himself or an aide have told the White House and the so-called Gang of Eight leaders in Congress about his surgery before it even happened in the first place?
I mean, blatantly so. I mean, this is pretty much the White House position, right? They said this was not optimal, I believe was the quote from a spokesman. It's just that somehow it should have been made clear who is in charge at any given moment, when is he just, you know, in a hospital or unavailable. But also, as you mentioned, especially now, you know, regardless of whatever technical rule there is, just, you know, in effect, they're now the Defense Secretary now is Defense Secretary during a time of multiple military conflicts across multiple regions, all of which were extremely volatile, and as you mentioned, you know, involved a new, you know, bombing campaign that just started yesterday. Yeah, there's obviously some breakdown here when folks are finding things out days later in the middle of, you know, a military conflict.
Mm-hmm. Idris, from a national security standpoint, this is a huge deal. So what is next for Lloyd Austin?
Well, you're right. It's an incredibly huge deal. The Secretary of Defense is the civilian who is in charge of the military. Formal military chain of command runs through him. Obviously, he can delegate some of those powers to the Deputy Secretary, as he did, but incredibly important that people know where he is and what he's doing. He's not formally in the nuclear command structure. The President basically has that authority on his own, but nonetheless, he's an important person you would want in the room if anything like that was happening. And also just generally, cabinet secretaries tend to have just less privacy. We got advance notice of a surgery that Merrick Garland was having, of colonoscopy that Joe Biden was having. Pete Buttigieg had to clear his parental leave with the White House before he took it. There is a kind of expectation of privacy that maybe Lloyd Austin has, but that isn't, met with reality. And what comes within the White House so far is supporting him. But a lot of Republicans, a lot of Democrats are pretty upset on Capitol Hill, and at least one Democrat has called for him to resign. So I don't think it's going to go away. The White House has commissioned a review. They've signaled that they're unhappy. He might be able to survive, if only to avoid a confirmation fight that will be looming. But it's a pretty big and quite weird occurrence, really, for all this to have happened.
So a big story on Capitol Hill this week is that once again a government shutdown is looming. On Thursday, Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he's taking the first steps to pass a stopgap funding measure before next Friday's deadline. Benji, how close is Congress to a deal this time around? And what's at stake if a compromise isn't reached?
Well, in theory, they basically have a deal, which is sort of the problem right now, which is that, this has been the story of the entire Congress, which is that there's a very small House Republican majority. They face a Democratic-led Senate, they face a Democratic White House, and they also have their own internal divisions. And that's made it extremely difficult for basic kind of so-called must-pass legislation to happen. Legislation that needs to raise the debt ceiling earlier, for example, which is what really was responsible for knocking out Kevin McCarthy. Legislation to fund the government, like the prior CR that got us here. And what's happened every time is that because there isn't really an effective Republican majority. None of these bills that end up can pass on Republican votes alone. They often need, 100, 200 Democrats to pass. Many Republicans will vote no on them. It's very hard for Republicans to negotiate, because if you send someone like Mike Johnson out and he announces he has a deal on, the most important part, how much they're spending, in a new funding agreement, and conservatives can then say, we reject that deal, it's not a real deal, we demand you change it. If he caves, it doesn't really matter who's speaker. You need someone who can negotiate on behalf of the House and, stick to it. Otherwise, why bother even negotiating with them if they can't stand by a deal? So this is just a continuation of the problem they've had the entire Congress. It's going to be resolved probably either with something like the deal announced passing or Mike Johnson being ousted and another round of chaos to choose a successor.
More drama on Capitol Hill. Yeah, we did also have a very surprising visitor on Capitol Hill this week on Wednesday. Hunter Biden popped into the House Oversight Committee hearing as they met about holding him in contempt of Congress. Last month, the president's son refused to testify at a closed-door deposition as part of the committee's impeachment proceedings against his father, but Hunter Biden said he would testify publicly.
You're the epitome of white privilege, coming into the Oversight Committee, spitting in our face, ignoring a congressional subpoena to be deposed. What are you afraid of?
That was South Carolina Republican Nancy Mace addressing Hunter Biden during his unannounced visit. Idris, Hunter Biden left after 15 minutes. Why did he go to the hearing in the first place with his attorneys?
Well, he went to make a statement, clearly. So, like you said, he refused to participate in a closed-door hearing. He said that he worried that his words would be selectively leaked if that were the case. So he insisted that he only testify in a public setting. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet. There was a hearing held in contempt. It's interesting. I didn't really think of Nancy Mace as a white privilege sort of believer, but there we are. And then he left as Marjorie Taylor Greene was speaking, which also caused some hoopla. I imagine the White House would rather all of this just go away, but it seems like we will have some of the spectacle continuing over the months ahead.
That's Idris Kaloun of The Economist, and we're also talking with Semaphor's Benji Sarlin. Aviation safety officials are still investigating what happened when a door plug blew off a Boeing 737 MAX 9 aircraft belonging to Alaskan Airlines just minutes after takeoff from Portland, Oregon last Friday. A boy's shirt was slipped out of the hole in the plane, along with several phones and personal items during the terrifying incident, but fortunately no one was seriously hurt. The FAA has grounded all of Boeing 737 MAX 9 planes with door plugs for the time being. The The order has caused Alaska Airlines and United to cancel upwards of 2,000 flights. Idris, how is this affecting business?
So I took a look at Boeing's share price before this, and it's actually down only 10%, which is not what I would have expected. You know, the 737 MAX was supposed to be a huge part of their, you know, lineup. It's I think the majority of their orders are actually those planes. They had a huge kind of public relations disaster on their hands when 2 of the 737 MAXs that they put out crashed. That was due to fault in the autopilot, which caused, you know, the noses of the planes to tip down and resulted in 2 tragic crashes. So obviously Boeing wanted to move on from that. The fact that these door plugs have been loose, and I think the FAA, which mandated an inspection of all planes that met this orientation, found a couple of other planes in which there were similarly loose bolts. You know, the FAA is pretty upset. They said that this incident should never have happened, it cannot happen again. They said that they would audit the assembly line. More fines might be in place for Boeing. So it's really not good news, but I mean, you know, at least shareholders for the moment don't seem to think that it's an existential threat to the company.
Well, in terms of taking responsibility, here's Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun on his company's response to the incident.
We're going to approach this, number one, acknowledging our mistake. We are going to approach it with 100% and complete transparency at every step of the way.
So Benji, the FAA is investigating whether the plane was built safely, whether it matched the approved design. How could the agency's findings affect Boeing's future as a leading plane manufacturer?
Well, it's pretty big. I mean, obviously, safety is the most important part of the brand in any plane, but also how long this investigation goes, how long planes are grounded, whether it discovers an issue that's potentially more systemic as they face more scrutiny. I mean, there's a lot of money to that. I mean, when the 737 was previously grounded from 2019 to 2020 after the 2 crashes that Idris mentioned, the total cost reported by Boeing from the incident was $20 billion with a B. So, you know, we're not talking about, even for one of the largest corporations in the world, we're not talking about chump change here. I mean, this is, you know, when your core business is planes and your brand new plane is, you know, being grounded, it's not good news.
Some big news also from the NFL. Now that the regular season is closed and the first round playoff matchups are set for this weekend, the coaching shuffle has begun. Among those now out of a job, Bill Belichick. I never thought I would say those words. He's out after 24 seasons and a record 6 Super Bowl titles with the New England Patriots. But his tenure was mired in controversy such as Deflategate by the end, and his falling out with quarterback Tom Brady, whose departure paved the way for the team's poor record for the last 3 seasons. Meanwhile, in college football, longtime Alabama coach Nick Saban has retired. He coached there for 17 seasons and won 6 national championship titles, wrapping up one of the greatest coaching careers in the history of the college game. So let's end with some news from the world of finance and Bitcoin, among other cryptocurrencies. On Tuesday, the Securities and Exchange Commission said its account on X, which all of us remember as Twitter, was hacked. The hackers took the opportunity to post in part, quote, "Today the SEC grants approval for Bitcoin ETFs, meaning exchange-traded funds, for listing on all registered national securities exchanges." Idris, for people like me who don't normally deal with finance, what does that post mean?
Well, the SEC did later approve, you know, Bitcoin ETFs, but an ETF basically lets you easily invest in the value of an underlying asset without having to trade the thing itself. So you can invest, for example, in the S&P 500. You buy an ETF that basically tracks the value of the stock market over time, and what the or you know, you can track the value of oil without actually having to literally go on a commodities market. What the Bitcoin ETF lets you do is essentially lets ordinary investors track more closely the actual value of Bitcoin as part of their portfolio. So previously, the SEC didn't allow these ETFs to actually use the underlying Bitcoins as part of their kind of currency, so it was very hard to actually track, and you had to actually go to an exchange to actually buy and sell these things, which meant that you had to pay transaction costs, etc. I don't know that I'm actually shedding any light on this, but all in all, it's to say, if you want to get some of the upside of Bitcoin's increase in value or share in the loss of its next crash, then it will be more easy for you to do that.
Benji, do we know who was behind the alleged hack of the SEC account and what their motivation would be?
Well, the motivation between a lot of these hacks, and this is in line with a lot of more sophisticated version of them.
Oh man, it's cold. Okay. Okay, back to the office.
Alex, the U.S., meanwhile, has been urging Israel to shift to more precise operations, specifically targeting Hamas. UN agencies say that as recently as last week, their aid convoys were fired on, charges the Israeli government has denied. A listener, Beams in Minnesota, writes to us, if Israel were acting like a civil society, they would be taking seriously wounded Gaza residents, and they would open up their hospitals to the injured. So tell us, what is Israel doing about these charges, and how dire is the humanitarian situation there?
It's very, very bad. I mean, you laid out some of the statistics earlier. I would say that just yesterday I spoke with Senator Chris Van Hollen, who traveled to Egypt and Jordan and saw how the aid was getting into Gaza, I should say, was not. He was noting that there were massive warehouses full of water testing kits, medical kits required for baby birth. There were other water desalination kits, and what would happen is a lot of these trucks, that's all the rejected aid. A lot of trucks that try to get in don't do so because even though they have pre-clearance, there's some guard at some checkpoint that decides, some things can be used as weapons. In one case that stuck out to me, tents were taken back because apparently the metal poles could be used as weapons. So this is one reason, not the reason, but a reason why aid isn't getting in as often. And so you have the Israelis not really changing their policies too much. I mean, they have opened up a new crossing at Kerem Shalom, and there's hope that they'll open up another one in Eretz. But mostly speaking, the Israelis are continuing. Yes, they're doing more target operations, but the campaign itself continues. Aid isn't really getting in, and you do have aid workers saying that the deconfliction mechanism, which is to say, trucks or aid workers are here, please don't bomb here, that is the most broken they've ever seen in any conflict. So it's dire already, and it's more dire every day.
On Thursday, meanwhile, South Africa formally accused Israel of committing genocide against the Palestinian people and pleaded with the United Nations top court in The Hague to order an immediate halt to Israeli military operations in Gaza. Here are some of the remarks from the lawyer representing South Africa.
International community continues to fail the Palestinian people, despite the overt, dehumanizing, genocidal rhetoric by Israeli governmental and military officials, matched by the Israeli army's actions on the ground. Despite the horror of the genocide against the Palestinian people being live streamed from Gaza to our mobile phones, computers, and television screens, the first genocide in history where its victims are broadcasting their own destruction in real time in the desperate, so far vain hope that the world might do something.
Scathing words from the lawyer representing South Africa at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Israel has vehemently denied the allegations. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said, quote, "This is an upside-down world. The state of Israel is accused of genocide while it is fighting genocide. The hypocrisy of South Africa screams to the heavens." The case against Israel has been fueled not just by the war, but by statements that were made by various members of the Israeli government after the October 7th Hamas attacks. Take a listen to these remarks as compiled by the BBC's Paul Adams, starting with Israel's President Isaac Herzog.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible.
Here's the hardline Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, interviewed on Israeli television, saying of the Palestinian population, they're all terrorists and they should be destroyed. In Parliament, the Deputy Speaker, Nissim Vaturi, said, "We all have one common goal, erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth."
So Nancy, what is South Africa looking to achieve in this case, and can it actually stop the fighting from continuing?
So the case that they brought forward essentially says that there has been a breach of the 1948 Convention Against Genocide, and so they make sort of 5 points towards that, including the mass killing of Palestinians, bodily and mental harm, forced displacement and food blockades, and destruction of the healthcare system. And so while the ruling on whether this is a genocide would take years, what they're seeking in the meantime is something that's called a provisional measure. And that would be something that would come through in a matter of weeks, and it would essentially, if they find that to be the case, would put pressure on other signatories of the Genocide Convention to put pressure on Israel to stop its war in Gaza. The challenge, at least in the short term, is the past efforts to oppose past findings of provisional measures, for example, Myanmar, have not been successful. And so long term, South Africa is seeking the classification of what's happening in Gaza right now as a genocide. Short term, it is seeking some legal means through the principal judicial organ of the UN to stop the fighting.
Well, Nancy, on the one side there's the Court of Justice, but there's also the very important Court of Global Public Opinion in this case. So how do you think this all stacks up in terms of how Israel's actions are being seen on the world stage?
It's interesting because I think this case in particular sort of brought forth some of the core issues to this, and you even heard it in some of the legal arguments that were happening earlier today. One of them you spoke about earlier, which is intent. For a case like this to be seen as a genocide, South Africa must prove intent. And what we've heard in some of those quotes from Israel is that that's rhetoric that doesn't actually reflect policy. The other thing that they are going to, I think, try to show on the Israeli side is that this is self-defense. And so what I heard from readers this week as they were talking about this case is that this was the first time that there was sort of a detailed case made about the conduct of the war, to have a discussion in a legal setting about what Israel is doing. We've heard the U.S. call these claims baseless, but I think it has spurred a discussion about the prosecution of a war in such a dense urban environment after a nation has come under attack. What is sort of the acceptable form of conduct? And we've started to see a discussion around that through this case.
Well, Nancy, one of our listeners, Kit, has a question for you that just came through. He says Israel has apparently destroyed almost all the buildings and infrastructure in Gaza. Will they rebuild it? And if not, who will rebuild and who will pay for it, Nancy?
Well, we haven't heard an answer to that up until now. One of the things about these cases and these laws is that they are often written, frankly, in favor of nations that are coming under threat, proper sort of traditional militaries. And so Israel's argument throughout the war has been that we have conducted these strikes in self-defense, and legally, under, for example, the laws of armed conflict, that if there's a feeling that the country has come under threat, that they can strike. There doesn't have to be a long case sort of made for why a building is being struck. And so none of these laws really deal with who's responsible for rebuilding when it turns out that wasn't a target, or was a legitimate target, but it hurt other civilians. And so that's one of the reasons you saw Secretary Blinken in the region this week, his 5th trip to Israel since the war began, is to try to come up with a way to rebuild. Who would rebuild? Where would the rebuilding happen? Because for all the case law on how to conduct war, there's very little on how to rebuild in the post-war period. There is no framework.
That's Nancy Youssef of the Wall Street Journal. We're also speaking with Alex Ward of Politico and Michelle Jamrisco of Bloomberg News. Let's switch over to South America and let's take a listen to what happened in Ecuador this week. Those sounds were broadcast to thousands in Ecuador this week after a gang of more than a dozen armed gunmen took over a public television station in the country, taking its staff hostage before police arrived and arrested the attackers. Ecuador's president has since declared an internal war against several drug trafficking gangs that he has classified as terrorist groups. State officials say these gangs are responsible for recent car bombings and the murders of 2 police officers, but the truth is that drug-related violence has been escalating in Ecuador for months. Michelle, why are we seeing this steady and troubling explosion of violence in Ecuador, which until recently was considered a bastion of stability in the Andes?
Yeah, and for many Americans, this must seem like it came out of nowhere, especially for those who help make up typically the largest source of Ecuador's foreign tourism. But if we look at the root of this, we had Ecuadorian President Noboa releasing a plan earlier this month to reform the prison system. They've had issues for some time, and just after that plan was released, a pair of notorious drug lords escaped from prison. Noboa started that nationwide manhunt, as you mentioned. So chaos has really ensued, and we're at this point where the nation is essentially on lockdown. And as of Wednesday, the government closed public schools, government offices, a lot of private businesses also shutting down, the military saying it has the authority to kill gang members. So just a very sad story for a nation that found a silver lining, really, in tourism post-COVID. But now they're dealing with economic crisis, organized crime surge, the murder rate doubled last year, and it's not getting any better. So Ecuadorians had already ranked violence as their #1 worry in the recent presidential election a few months ago. That put 36-year-old Noboa in power, and now it just seems to be escalating out of control.
You're right, Michelle, that the Galapagos are a favored destination for American tourists, not to mention Quito and Guayaquil. Guayaquil is now considered incredibly dangerous. Alex, the country's prisons have descended into chaos. As Michelle said, the president declared a state of emergency Monday when Adolfo Macias, one of the country's most powerful gang leaders, escaped from prison. What is the government doing to actually bring this under control?
Well, one thing President Noboa has decided to do, as you said, is have an internal armed conflict, and he said he would neutralize the over 20 gangs that he designated as terrorist organizations. And so he's looking at actually an example from El Salvador, where President Bukele has decided to curtail civil liberties, build massive prisons, escalate police action, basically throw away some laws in order to go after, drug groups. And Noboa is basically interested in that kind of plan. That's the fear, is that he would really go above and beyond what is already kind of in the legal recourse for police action. So the initial worry is that there's going to be a very sort of militarized component to this reaction. Now, of course, there would need to be. These are gangs. They are armed. They are taking over hospitals, schools, TV stations, etc. But the worry that people have is that these kinds of military actions should normally be paired with something else, some sort of drug reduction programs or infrastructure development. Basically, taking an example out of Columbia's playbook. We haven't heard that yet. Frankly, it's early. But that is the worry, that at this first point, you're going to see an uptick of violence to hopefully, over time, downtick violence. But you don't know if Noboa is going to eventually reverse this curtail of civil liberties, because that hasn't really happened in El Salvador.
All right, let's switch over to Asia, where elections are taking place in Taiwan on Sunday in the shadow of pressure from the People's Republic of China, which considers Taiwan to be a breakaway province. Taiwan has been self-governing since 1945 after breaking away from communist rule and has held direct presidential elections since 1996. And this just out from China's Defense Ministry's Zhang Xiaogang, a very saber-rattling statement that just came out in which he said the Chinese People's Liberation Army maintains high vigilance at all times and will take all necessary measures to firmly crush Taiwan independence attempts of all forms. Nancy, remind us about the politicians who are running and what is at stake.
So there are three major candidates running. There's the current vice president, and his party is known as the Democratic Progressive Party for being more openly pro-independent. There's the Nationalist Party, which is, and their candidate is a former police officer and current mayor of New Taipei, who's advocating for closer relations with China. And then there's a new party that emerged in 2019 called Taiwan's People's Party, and the former mayor of Taipei is the candidate for that. There have been polls that have been conducted that show that Lei Cheng-ti, the vice president, is the leading candidate, but only by a few percentage points. I should note that polls tend to close 2 weeks before elections, so it's unclear how reliable those results are. But either way, we know that it's a very close election. Remember that Taiwan's president, her term expires, and so she had to leave after finishing her 2-term limit. Should her vice president win, it would be the first time that a party has secured a third consecutive term. And what's at stake is the future of Taiwan's relationship both with China and the United States. The current president has been quite aggressive and sort of standing up for those who are looking for more independent leanings. With a race this close, we could see a shift either towards Taiwan or on the path that the state is on right now. It's a close election, and it's hard to call, and everybody will be watching Saturday for results that could come out in a matter of hours by Saturday night.
All right, that's Nancy Youssef of the Wall Street Journal. We're also speaking with Alex Ward of Politico and Michelle Jamrisco of Bloomberg. We'll talk more about China when we come back after the break, and we'll also talk about how it's less than a month until Pakistan's election. Will a cricket bat be on the ballot? We'll explain in a moment. I'm Indira Lakshmanan, and this is 1A. 30 years ago saw the publication of the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Its colorful Savannah, Georgia seemed stranger than fiction.
One critic said I cherry-picked my character, and I plead guilty of that. Of course I cherry-picked them. I would want to read about boring people.
I'm Mary Louise Kelly. How the book changed the city. On All Things Considered from NPR News.
Cincinnati broadcasting legend Nick Cooner turns 90 tomorrow. The Cincinnati edition went to Augusta, Kentucky to speak with Nick about his career, his family, and much more. That's coming up at noon.
Support comes from the Manifest Center for the Visual Arts, celebrating its 20th season, showcasing contemporary art from around the world in their East Walnut Hills galleries on Woodburn Avenue, and offering personal enrichment workshops like the weekly Drawing as Mindfulness at their new campus at 3464 Central Parkway. More at manifestvisualarts.org.
Hi, I'm Scott Horsley from NPR. You've probably heard me talking about inflation and how the price of used
cars and trucks is way up. That also means the old car or truck you don't need anymore is worth more as a donation. So if you don't need that old vehicle, or it's going to be too expensive to repair, why not donate it to this radio station? It's easy, free to you, and it'll have a big impact. Please, think about it.
To donate your car, go to wvxu.org under Ways to Give.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Workday. With AI at the core of its system, Workday is committed to delivering continuous innovation to help teams stay agile. Workday, the finance and HR system for a changing world. From Made in Cookware, partnering with chefs like Tom Colicchio to bring professional-grade cookware to restaurants and home kitchens. Their cookware can be found at madeincookware.com. And from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
I'm Indira Lakshmanan, and it's the 1A News Roundup with Nancy Youssef of the Wall Street Journal, Alex Ward of Politico, and Michelle Jamrisco of Bloomberg News. Michelle, turning back to Taiwan, Chinese President Xi Jinping had this to say about the unification of China and Taiwan on New Year's Eve 2 weeks ago.
The reunification of the motherland is a historical inevitability. Compatriots on both sides of the Taiwan Strait should be bound by a common sense of purpose and share in the glory of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
So, Michelle, Chinese military has said it will never compromise its position that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. What has been the reaction in Taiwan to all of these statements and saber rattling?
Well, I think you've seen, even though there are different shades of support for whether the more U.S.-friendly candidate or the more China-friendly candidates, I think most of the vast majority of the Taiwanese population just clearly want to kind of maintain a sort of status quo where they're not so much moving immediately toward independence, but they're also not going to be quickly absorbed into China's orbit again. And I think that's, of course, at odds with the message that President Xi is sending. So at its base, it makes them very uncomfortable to hear these sorts of things, coming from the Chinese leader. And what we're also following is how does this translate into, a sort of interference campaign? And this is something that has been a huge concern of the U.S. and others, to see China kind of meddling in the election in some ways. The past few weeks, we've seen Taiwan talk about a campaign of misinformation, disinformation, social media posts, military exercises more concretely, balloons floating over the island. There was an air raid siren earlier this week from Taiwan because of some of these exercises. And they're all, analysts looking at this are saying this is all just designed to kind of intimidate, to coerce, voting in a certain direction. They even had an instance where Chinese officials were coercing a rock group to voice support for reunification. So it's coming in a lot of different forms. And, the VP Lai, who's also a presidential candidate, mentioned that, this is always something that they deal with in Taiwanese elections, certain kind of influence campaigns by the mainland. But this year, he says it's the most serious it's ever been. When we asked the U.S. senior administration official earlier this week about it in a briefing, the response was that, we'll let the Taiwanese speak for themselves, but they have seen meddling in the sort of information environment in Taiwan, as they put it. At the same time, they have full confidence in Taiwan's democratic process and don't think that meddling will determine the outcome.
So, Nancy, let me ask you, you're in close touch with U.S. national security officials, Defense Department officials all the time. Is there any indication that the attack from China has entered a new phase and that Xi Jinping is ready to take military action?
I haven't heard that yet. We haven't seen any indication that China's leadership has changed its views towards unification with Taiwan, which Xi has called inevitable. The Chinese military has been operating at a heightened military tempo since Nancy Pelosi's visit, in ebbs and flows, but we haven't seen a marked difference. Having said all that, the event I think many people are watching is the election this weekend, because I think that will be the best indicator of China's intentions going forward. And nobody knows how they react. Part of that, of course, will depend on the results of the election, but also how China interprets those results and chooses to act not only sort of diplomatically and in its rhetoric, but how it positions itself militarily. So I think one reason we haven't heard a change in sort of assessments is because the big event is the one happening Saturday.
All right. Well, switching to the hot war that is very much happening, it's been nearly 2 years now, believe it or not, since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This morning, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak visited Ukraine to announce an increase in military aid to the tune of £2.5 billion in the next year. That's an increase of £200 million over the past 2 years.
That's why I'm here on my first foreign visit of this year, the first foreign leader to visit Ukraine this year. I want to send a strong signal of support to the Ukrainian people, but also a strong signal of support that Vladimir Putin needs to recognise we're not going anywhere. I'm here with one clear message: the United Kingdom stands with Ukraine.
So, Alex, this aid includes weapons, humanitarian aid, and drones, all at a time when U.S. Congress is struggling over whether to increase our aid for Ukraine. What is the message that Rishi Sunak is sending by increasing the spending while the U.S. has been unable to do so?
Well, I think he's trying to reassure Ukraine because the situation has moved on. Granted, we've been talking about other things so far today for good reason. There's a lot going on in the world: Israel, Hamas, the Taiwan elections, etc. So, if you're the Ukrainian government, you're not feeling that love as much. And of course, you're seeing what's going on in Congress here in the U.S. And so you're thinking maybe the West's support is drying up. So having Sunak there effectively voting with his feet and bringing a massive of weapons and humanitarian aid is a sign that there's still a tension. President Zelensky is actually headed to Davos next week in order to talk to world leaders and basically make sure that the Ukrainian situation is still top of mind. And right now, one of the things Zelensky has been pretty good at and has been pretty good at is maintaining support for Ukraine by showing up, by giving speeches, by looking leaders in the world and saying, you're going to keep supporting us, right? Of course, it's somewhat out of Biden's hands to some extent because of Congress, but by having those kinds of meetings, it's a reminder to the Sunaks and the others of the world that, hey, you should still keep supporting this war. And as you said, we're heading to the 2-year part, and we're sort of at this game of ping pong, artillery ping pong on the ground, right? That's where everyone keeps saying there's a stalemate. That's somewhat true on the ground. It's a different battle at sea, where Russian naval forces have been pushed back quite a bit. There's not much stalemate there. But point is, for anything to advance, Ukraine still is going to need a lot of help. And that's why you have Zelensky constantly making these cases.
So, Nancy, this week Russian officials evacuated 300 residents from the Russian border city of Belgorod after Ukrainian military strikes had rained down on the city. That was the deadliest Ukrainian attack since Russia's invasion, and it came on December 30th of last year. 25 Russian civilians were killed. Ukrainian cities and civilian buildings and civilians have been bombed throughout the war by Russia. Is Ukraine now retaliating in kind inside Russia, Nancy, or is this just, we think, a rare one-off? And also I want to ask you, 2 years into this war, are we any closer to a conclusion?
Well, what we saw preceding that evacuation and the Ukrainian strike was a Russian strike, the biggest one we'd ever seen in Kyiv, and so it appeared to be a response to that. To me, what was extraordinary is that the decision to evacuate was one of the few sort of acknowledgments by Russia that the war in Ukraine poses a threat to its residents, and it was such a demonstrative display of that. You were asking about where we are 2 years in the war, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think the one way to describe it is stuck. I think when people think of stalemates, I worry that they think that nothing is happening, but there's a lot of intense fighting happening. As we've talked about, we've seen some pretty intense attacks just in the last few weeks. There just hasn't been any advancement on either side to break its opponent's defenses. And it's unclear whether Ukraine and its allies can craft an alternative approach. As Alex rightly noted, we're having weeks-long discussions about funding for Ukraine. Ukraine's lost thousands of troops, including some of its most skilled and best fighters. And so we're at this point where there's a lot of fighting happening, but we are stuck in terms of seeing any demonstrative progress one way or the other. And so there's no, frankly, indication that this war is getting closer to concluding.
One really painful human cost story here on the side of the Ukrainian-Russian war is that Ukrainian authorities say that nearly 20,000 Ukrainian children have been deported from their country into Russia since the start of the war. And this week, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree that makes it possible to reassign those children Russian citizenship. Michelle, Ukraine this week condemned that decree, but what is the story here? Were these children taken to Russia against their will? What's happened to their parents? What more do we know?
Well, it is certainly very terribly sad and very difficult to pinpoint numbers on this, trying to break down who was orphaned or who might have been forcibly taken from living family members. The bottom line, though, is that in the eyes of the International Criminal Court and Ukraine and others, these are children who have been forcibly deported to Russia amid the war. The ICC last year, they issued an arrest warrant for Putin and the same for at least one other Russian official on these grounds, that they were forcibly deporting children. And we know that Russia right now has every reason to use these children as pawns. I mean, for two reasons, basically. By giving them citizenship, they would arguably help Russia avoid others identifying these children as forcibly removed Ukrainians. And also, it would help their pretty atrocious demographic issues in Russia right now. We know the Russian military has been decimated. The birth rate is abysmally low, even in a world where so many countries are suffering the same way. So to get a whole swath of new citizens would be a big boon economically for them.
All right, in another part of the world, Pakistan goes to the polls in a general election scheduled for February 8th, which was delayed from last November, and it's looking like a contest that might be won by a familiar face, Pakistan's three-time former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. This week, Pakistan's Supreme Court reversed its 6-year-old verdict that had disqualified politicians from running for election if they were found not to be, quote, honest and righteous. The former Prime Minister Sharif has had quite a bit of legal trouble, but last month Islamabad's High Court overturned his 2018 conviction for corruption, for which he'd been sentenced to 10 years in prison. That same court acquitted him in another graft case last November. Alex, tell us why Sharif is now looking like a winner.
Well, his Pakistan Muslim League party is the front runner in these legislative elections, and so he's the most likely to benefit. The fact that he's allowed to, be in this election at all, which is quite a stunning change. I mean, this 6-1 ruling by the Supreme Court really shifts the tide of power right now in Pakistan. And you've got, there was a moment where Imran Khan was the prime minister, Sharif in legal trouble, and now it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm. The military has thrown their weight behind Sharif, have they not?
Precisely. So, and it's really hard to be in charge of Pakistan if you don't have the military behind you. I'm pretty sure every modern prime minister has not finished their term, because usually there's some sort of change in either military thinking or civilian thinking. So it's a massive shift of fortunes for Sharif and his party, and it could really just upend politics in Pakistan for the years to come.
Nancy, another former Pakistani prime minister, international cricket star Imran Khan, has been behind bars since August in a corruption case, and he's been disqualified from running for office, but a recent court case cleared the way for his party's symbol, the cricket bat, to appear on the ballot. Tell us about what his chances are, and is the election being regarded as free and fair?
Well, I thought Alex described it so beautifully. I'll just add that Imran Khan wrote from prison this week for The Economist that he thinks his party is being muzzled and that the election can't be trusted because he's out of favor with the army. We've also heard from independent observers who say they're increasingly concerned that the election won't be fair. The U.S. has called for free and fair elections. I think the challenge we've seen in Pakistan in the past is that its judiciary has a long history of passing and then overturning rulings that favor the political party, the army it backs. That all this is happening just 1 month before the election certainly suggests that the army is putting its fingers on the scale and tipping it in favor of Sharif. And so is that free and fair? It doesn't appear to be so in the pure sense of the term, given the amount of machinations happening from the court, from the military, ahead of this critical election.
We've also got some otherworldly news this week, if you want to talk about things that are even beyond international. The first American spacecraft headed for the moon in 50 years might not make it there after all. The Peregrine lunar lander was launched on Monday, but it's expected to run out of fuel before it reaches the moon's surface because of propellant leak. Michelle, what went wrong here?
Yeah, well, I'm a big space fan, and I think for anyone who has an interest and fascination with these sorts of operations, this is sad news. The Astrobiotic, the Pittsburgh-based company that created the spacecraft, they conceded a pretty big propulsion problem in space shortly after it got there with the module, and that likely caused it to sort of start running out of fuel. They posted on social media at some point this week that they suspected that there was a valve problem that caused a rush of high-pressure helium, and that ruptured the tank, but they'll have a full review after the mission is done. We do know that in the meantime, the module is able to collect some valuable data that NASA is also monitoring quite closely. So as far as, where this goes from here, we'll have to see. They have, I saw yesterday, they said it had about 48 hours to go with fuel, and they were about 94% of lunar distance at that point.
All right, time for my favorite part of the show. It's Reporter's Notebook time. Nancy, a few minutes before we wrap, what stories are you watching for the coming week?
Well, the one that sort of hijacked the week and I think is not done yet is the fate of the Secretary of Defense, whether he'll be back at work, what impact all this tumult over his absence has on his place in national security, and whether this continues to be a discussion that sort of is a patina over all these issues that we have been talking about over the past hour.
Alex?
As a Patriots fan, I do care about the Bill Belichick leaving, but as a soccer fan, where Kylian Mbappe goes, I think what I'm interested, though, is the surprising backlash to the Houthis from Democrats and some Republicans. There were congressional leaders that backed it, but whether this ends up being a political problem,
Michelle, what's in your notebook?
The NFL team is not in the playoffs.
Standing up to developers suddenly grew when actor and filmmaker Tyler Perry took to social media pledging support. He donated thousands to the family's GoFundMe page. Then rapper Snoop Dogg did too, and NBA star Kyrie Irving. Wright's message of perseverance was shared around the world.
I feel so much pride and comfort in knowing that this is where I will be for the rest of my life.
Wright died Sunday as the battle over her property drags on in court. But those who have fought to save the rapidly disappearing land and culture of the direct descendants of enslaved Africans say they now have an ally in Wright's legacy. Wright's family started a foundation in her name to help other families save their ancestral land. Victoria Smalls of nearby St. Helena Island calls Wright an example of what Gullah Geechee communities can do.
To hold on to dear life, to our land and our culture and our people.
Wright was known as Grandma Josephine to those close to her, including Altamise Nicole. She's friends with one of Wright's 40 grandchildren and has served as the family spokesperson. She remembers a day she scheduled a media interview with Wright at her home.
I show up at the house, I'm like, hey Grandma, and they're like, give just like 30 minutes. Grandma's upholstering some furniture. And I'm like, what?
She says the 94-year-old also made robes for the church choir, all while fighting to save her family's land. For NPR News, I'm Victoria Hansen in South Carolina.
You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
The Australian Open kicks off this weekend, and there are a number of comeback headlines and disappointments, something to pique the interest of both casual and devout tennis fans. Courtney Nguyen has a front row seat to everything. She is senior writer with WTA Insider. She joins us now from Melbourne. Hey there, welcome back.
Hello, Mary Liz. How are you doing?
I am well, and I want to start with this decision by the Australian Open to have an extra day of tennis. They're starting play on Sunday. Why?
They're starting to play on Sunday. They're following what the French Open started to do. They've had a Sunday start for a few years now, and they're doing it, they say, to alleviate the concerns about late night finishes, that basically these schedules get too stacked across 14 days. So they're thinking, well, if we spread it out across 15, that gives us a little bit more leeway to start matches on time so that we are not here at Melbourne Park until 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But it does, it gives them an extra day to sell tickets.
And I guess deal with unpredictable weather and all the rest of it. All right, the players. And I want to start with the women's side. Last year's champion is back. This is Arina Sabalenka. She is going to have some tough competition, though, starting with U.S. Open champ Coco Gauff, and then also Naomi Osaka making her return to the court after having a baby. What are you watching for there?
Yeah, I think that it's a great tournament insofar as the top 4 women, the ones that have been pretty much dominating the tour for the last year or two, are all in great form. They're virtually all undefeated to start the year. So Sabalenka does have her work cut out for her to defend her title here at Melbourne Park. Naomi Osaka is a big draw here. She has been in a great mood. She talked to the reporters yesterday, was affable, seemed to be very, very happy coming back. First time in 15 months since having her daughter. And it's an exciting time because these are the marquee players like Naomi Osaka, Caroline Wozniacki, Angelique Kerber, who are coming back and adding intrigue to a tour that has kind of skewed a little younger. You know, when we talk about the Coco Gauffs and world number 1 Iga Swiatek, who is kind of the favorite, these oldies but goodies are bringing it back. And I think that in a lot of ways, tennis fans are feeling very nostalgic.
California, where my husband and I just successfully dropped off all 3 of our kids at 3 different schools on time and with breakfast. This podcast was recorded at
12:25 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, January 12th.
Things may have changed by the time you hear this, but we will still be celebrating all the parents who made it through the challenging but wonderful daily ritual of morning school drop-off. Okay, here's the show.
It just never gets easier.
Kids, man, my daughter's figured out that I can cook, so every morning now, or the night before, she's asking me for very specific things to make her in the morning. I want avocado toast with egg today. Okay.
Well, a girl knows what she wants.
She does, and it's good.
Hey there, it's the Imperial Politics Podcast. I'm Tamara Keith. I cover the White House.
I'm Don Gagne, National Political Correspondent.
And I'm Domenico Montanaro, Senior Political Editor and Correspondent.
Monday night at 7 p.m. Central Time, Iowa Republicans will gather in school gyms and libraries and maybe even people's houses to caucus. It is happening, and we hope that this podcast will be your guide. Don, you are joining us from Iowa. What does it look like there right now?
This is where I exhale deeply before I start describing the weather. I'm looking out my hotel room window, and the visibility is practically at 0, and the temperature is in the single digits. It is snowing, and this is the calm part of the weather system.
Wait, you're telling me this is the good part?
On caucus day, which is Monday, the high is expected to be 2 degrees below 0. The low that day, which will hit sometime around the time the caucus doors open, is expected to be in the range of 19 degrees below 0. Oh, and it's going to be windy, so some projections are for that to be like 50 below 0 wind chill.
Don, do you expect that the weather will affect the turnout?
I don't see how it doesn't affect the turnout. The big question is how much. So, record Republican caucus turnout in Iowa took place in 2016. Ted Cruz won that caucus over Donald Trump, but it was pretty close. And they had like 186,000 people. And there was initially some talk that maybe Republicans would exceed that number this year. Except I'm talking to people who are involved in the ground games of these campaigns, and they're saying now, perhaps optimistically, it could be as low as 150,000 or lower than that. I don't know. That might feel like a crazy optimistic number as well.
The real question with this is whose voters actually show up.
Yeah, that's a huge question. And, the thing about the Iowa caucuses is that it has a pretty low participation rate to begin with. I mean, even the highest of Iowa turnouts, if you were to look at what that means for registration today, it's only about 1 in 4 registered Republicans who would participate, and it's usually more like 1 in 5, 1 in 6. So that's pretty low. And when you have weather like this, and you have candidates who are dependent on some people who may not have caucused before, it really throws a huge wild card into things. And I'm specifically thinking of the Trump campaign because they've really appealed to first-time caucus goers. They did that in 2016. They won over those first-time caucus goers who made up almost half of the caucuses in 2016. And by the way, almost half of Iowa caucus goers say that they decide within the last week on who they actually want to be their nominee. The Trump team has a much better field operation this time, but they're going to need snowplows and ATVs to get people to the polls.
Domenico, let's just step back. Remind us, what is an Iowa caucus?
Well, a caucus is unlike what you normally think of when you go vote. It's not going to a voting machine and putting in something on an electronic voting machine and then it's tallied, you walk in and walk out. No, it's not quite like that. It takes a little bit more time. It's a meeting. It's run by the state party, and these are happening in precinct caucuses. And so in little places all over the state, 1,657 different locations actually this time around. And that's going to mean that people are there for a while because they're going to have a process. You're going to hear from representatives of the campaign to make these 1-minute speeches. And that's why it's really important for these campaigns to have representatives, precinct captains, and they call them, at each of these places to try to sway people. Now, for people who think they know what the Iowa caucuses are like because they think they've seen some videos or whatever about how the Democrats do things, it's very, very different from that.
The good news is, for this Monday, we don't have to understand that process.
No, this is just, people just basically put in folded sheets of paper and submit a secret straw poll ballot that then gets added up and tallied to a central location to tell us who won the thing.
Dawn, you were able to get out before the storm hit and got all over Iowa. You saw 3 different candidates. What did you learn?
I saw Nikki Haley in the morning in the suburbs of Des Moines. She had 120 people or so at her event, and people there are feeling good because she has actually been moving up into the polls. If you look at the polling averages, she's in second place over DeSantis. Barely in second place, but that would be a good finish for her. Then in the afternoon, I went to a Trump event. It was not the former president. It was Donald Trump Jr. Again at this kind of classic place for political gatherings, the Machine Shed restaurant in a town called Urbandale. He was talking, kind of, riffing off the cuff, but he was talking about the weather a lot and telling people you have to show up. We're really going to make a big statement here in Iowa. Then in the evening, I saw again a crowd of a little more than 100 turn out for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. That was an event where he took questions and he really talked about people not believing the polls. He has slipped into 3rd place in Iowa, which would be disastrous for him, and you could kind of sense that urgency last night.
Dawn, you have covered several caucuses. Paint a picture of what they're like for us.
There is always a certain buzz on caucus day because these are the very first official votes being cast during the election primary caucus season. So there's good energy, and Iowans who have been enduring television ads for a year and candidate visits for a year, there is a sense that it's all coming to an end. Now, the other reality is, given that Iowa is no longer a battleground state, the show will leave town, go off to New Hampshire and the subsequent states, and people won't start paying any attention to Iowa again for about 3 years. This year, there are even questions as to whether or not the circus will come back to town.
At all.
3 years, at all.
Domenico, we have said this before, we will I'll say it again. Iowa, in a lot of ways, because it goes first, it's all about expectations. And we are now in the phase of the campaign where people are trying to temper expectations or play the expectations game. But what could various result scenarios mean for these candidates, especially based on the expectations that have already been set?
Yeah, I think there's two things to watch. One, it's the margins for Trump. How much does he win by if he wins? And what's the order of finish? You know, I think when Don was mentioning that Nikki Haley has sort of crept up and maybe a little ahead in the poll averages of Ron DeSantis, which would be a big deal if that were the case, because if Haley were to finish ahead of DeSantis in the place where DeSantis has gone all in, you know, it's hard for DeSantis to make a case that his campaign should continue. For Haley, it's really cake. If she's able to finish ahead of DeSantis, then she's got some momentum going into New Hampshire. Even if she finishes a close third, she's going to have met the expectations that a lot of people thought she would. And Trump, you know, this weather, who knows what it's going to mean, but he's been ahead by 20, 30 points in Iowa for the entirety of this campaign. If he finishes, you know, with a margin that's much smaller than that, you know, there's going to be some questions about his candidacy and a much more important fight that then lines up between him and likely Haley in New Hampshire.
All right, well, we will stop there and take a break. And when we come back, a roundup of all the other campaign news. And we're back. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie has ended his presidential campaign. Really the only candidate who was left in the race willing to run directly against Donald Trump. This was part of the speech where he said he was suspending his campaign.
If Donald Trump becomes the nominee of this party, the moment that it happened was when Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis and Tim Scott and Mike Pence and Doug Burgum and Vivek Ramaswamy stood on that stage in Milwaukee in August. And when we were asked, would you support someone who is a convicted felon to be president of the United States, they raised their hands.
You know, Chris Christie never really ran to be the nominee, and I think that what he's saying there really reflects that. You know, he was really there to pressure candidates and other Republican leaders and to try to make this case to Republican voters to abandon Trump. Whether or not he thought he was actually going to be the nominee, you know, in talking to people around his campaign, they said that he understood very well what the odds were in front of him. And that, in campaign speak, is he doesn't expect to be the nominee. The idea here was, again, to try to move on from Trump. And, you know, that's why his campaign has really become, you know, hard to look back on it and think is anything but a failure. Because, and it has to confound him, it has to frustrate him, because he made the arguments very clearly and concisely. Democrats liked what he was saying, but Republicans didn't pick up on it.
And I think what he's arguing there is he was the only one saying it, and because he was the only one saying it, he was isolated.
Yeah, and that's another thing that Republican strategists have said to me since the beginning of the Trump presidency and candidacy, frankly, is that without a unified voice from Republican leaders talking out against Trump's conduct, then they were ceding the ground to him to basically make the case to Republican voters. And, you know, by the time now he's running